This Marquee Dragon video is sponsored by Shattered Crystal, game codes, and items.
Hello, I'm Marquee Dragon, also known as Marcus Eikenberry in real life, and today I've got Kate Edwards with me. Now, Kate, what is the name of your company?
The name of my company is Englobe.
Englobe. And tell us what it is you do.
Well, essentially what I do is I'm a geographer who helps game developers avoid making really serious political and cultural mistakes in their game content. So when you're developing and you want your game to go overseas, it's the kind of stuff that localization typically doesn't cover. So it's not linguistic, it's more about things like symbols and history in the game and costumes and just pretty much everything other than language.
So give me an example of when this mattered. When somebody should have done this.
Oh, there's many examples, but one that's fairly well known, that's more well known. There was a game called Kakoru Chojin on the first Xbox, and it was like a hand-to-hand fighting game.
Okay.
And the developers had included a piece of audio in the game that was chanting from the Quran.
Oh.
And so the developers, they discovered it very late in development, and so they were trying to decide what should we do. Well, obviously the decision was to fix it, but the problem is that there were already copies on their way to the stores. And so the game eventually got released, but only in the US, under the assumption, not mine, but under the assumption that it's safe, that it'll be okay. Well, within a few months, the game ended up in Saudi Arabia and everywhere else in the Middle East through the black market and gray market and whatnot. And it became a very big issue. The governments were banning the game. It was front page news. It was just a disaster. And so the PR for the game, the image of the game became so tainted by this that the game eventually got recalled globally and was buried.
Wow.
And it's gone.
So they didn't, they say good press or bad press, it's all good press, but in this case it didn't work out quite that way?
No. Sometimes, the bad press can help a game, but this kind of bad press will devastate it.
And so how is it that you would, do you like review the game and how do you figure out that what you're hearing in the background is something that's going to offend someone else?
Well, like in my case, I don't speak Arabic, but my background is I'm a geographer and do cross-cultural work and geopolitics and whatnot. So I knew that it was Arabic. I know what Arabic sounds like. Now I can't speak it though. So that's where I went to an Arabic language specialist, and when I let him hear the track, he knew instantly. He is a Muslim, so when he heard it, he just kind of he got kind of upset. So like in my case, what I typically do, because I carry around a body of knowledge that's based on what I do for a living, it's pretty easy for me to spot this kind of stuff. Like if it's a symbol that's related to a certain religious sect or a religion or whatever, I know most of those. But a lot of it on a higher level, it's not just about knowing specifically what the issue is, it's knowing when to ask the question, that's one of the things I often tell.
That's the hardest part.
Well, it is, exactly, because that's one of the things I often try and tell game developers. You don't have to know all this stuff. That's what people like me are for. What you need to know is that you created a symbol. Do you know if that symbol is being used already by some culture? And if the answer is I don't know, well then you need to do more research and make sure you know.
That sounds like it could actually be exhaustive and cost a lot of money.
It could, but the nice part about it is that typically speaking, most of the really well-known, if we're just talking symbols as an example, most of the well-known symbols are, they're easy to spot. And even most people who, even if they went to like Wikipedia and looked up like a standard article on religious symbols or something, they'd probably be able to see like what the major ones are. There's a lot of, there does happen to be a lot of subtlety that sometimes happens. There's sometimes things like allegories that happen, like a game scenario might be portraying, for example, the US versus the Islamic world, or something like that, even though it's a complete sci-fi game, but the game developers, whether they knew it or not, they kind of built that feeling into it. And so sometimes I look for that kind of issue too, because it's whether or not you, the game developers, see it is not the issue. It's whether or not the gamer in that local market might perceive that as being the message. So
let me just run something by you here.
Okay.
So recently I interviewed Richard Garriott, and he talked about one of his favorite games was Ultima 4. And Ultima 4 is where he introduced spirituality, humility, valor, all of these, it was the 8 virtues and everything. And it was almost, I played the game, and it almost felt like a bit of a religious type experience in the game and everything. And how would you look at something like that? Would you have told him you shouldn't do that?
No, not necessarily, because I mean, there's a lot of games that contain some kind of faith system. I mean, most of the fantasy games have something, whether it's magic-based or spiritual in terms of like gods or deities or whatever. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just a matter of how you want to handle it. So, I mean, for example, like God of War uses well-known, archetypes of gods, from mythology. The way that they did it was well done, and this. At this point in our human history, there really you're not going to find a lot of people worshiping Mars, for example.
True.
So there's the distance of time that helps. So there might be religions that are old, like Babylonian and Assyrian stuff. Like that's why the Ghostbusters got away with Gozer the Gozerian and all that kind of stuff. Because it's like no one thinks about that kind of thing really. So if you have a distance, it's something that I actually call contextual proximity. And so the closer that a piece of content, whether it's a character or a place or a historical event, the closer it is to the real thing, the more sensitive it's going to be. I mean, it's a pretty simple idea. So if you're taking deities or faith systems based on the distant past, it's much less likely it's going to be an issue as if you were like making a system based on Christianity or something,
So tell me about some of the amazing stuff you've come across. Tell me a story.
There's been a lot of great stuff. For example, I just got finished working on Dance Central recently, and my role...
How could Dance Central offend anyone?
Well, see, that's a good question. Well, my role actually on Dance Central was to help discern some of the gestural issues. So as you're dancing and as you're making gestures with your hands and your body, there are gestures that were being used that
I could see a few.
Yeah, I mean, there's gestures, like this, and well, I can go through a whole bunch of other ones. I won't do it on camera, but there's a lot of gestures that mean the same thing as like the middle finger in the U.S. And most people don't know that here.
Right.
So there were things that I had to do, and other stuff too, like showing the bottom of your foot. It's very sensitive in some cultures, and so
I've learned that one.
Yeah. And so. Basically, my job was to essentially just, I don't want to try and, pardon me, my job is not to like be a political correctness police or anything like that. I'm just trying to make sure the game can go as many places as possible. So if there's a certain market that might be offended by like a certain gesture,
then they may not go to that market if they want to leave it in.
Exactly. And so it's just a matter, do you want to go to that market and sell there, or do you not want to go? It's a simple decision. It's like, if you want to go, then take the gesture out. And so a lot of the issues that I deal with tend to be very surgical like that. It's not like, well, this whole game concept is awful, don't do it. It's more like, don't make that character's helmet like that. That kind of thing. And there's a lot of that kind of stuff. But so that's one example on Dance Central. I mean, I worked on all the Age of Empires, and there were a lot of issues on there because you're dealing with real world history. And so, for example, there was one where the Korean government got very upset because in the scenario, which is based on real history,
they had a difference of opinion?
Oh, a very strong difference of opinion. So instead of the Japanese invading Korea, they said, no, that never happened. And so the scenario had to be patched for Korea to show the Koreans invading Japan. So there's a lot of things like that, which, as you can understand, even internally within a development team, that kind of decision can be controversial. Because, as a developer, you have a creative vision, which, for myself, that's my job, I feel, is I'm trying to support their creative vision. I just don't want their creative vision to be misunderstood when it goes overseas. And so sometimes, in order to avoid the misunderstandings, you have to tweak it a little bit, to make sure it's, but some developers make that decision and say, we don't care, we're not changing anything. It's like, okay, good luck.
Yeah.
So
sounds like a decision I would make. So, so if I'm developing a game, is there any concepts or things that I can think of to try and keep myself from making one of these mistakes, or do we just have to hire somebody like you?
Well, hiring someone like me is the smartest choice.
Well, of course. Well, there's always the expert. I mean, and so even though like my entrepreneurial stuff, I give away a lot of information for free.
Sure.
And I'm happy to.
Oh yeah.
But at the same time, what happens is I get people who come to me and they say, I don't have the time to do this. We know you're good at it. Please do it for us.
Oh, exactly.
Yes. So.
Yeah. Well, the thing that I do often when I give a talk, we get GDC or wherever, and I am trying to finish a handbook on this subject for game developers, hopefully this year. What I try and tell them, some of the most basic stuff you can do is just ask questions of your own work. So like I mentioned before, if you create symbols, ask yourself, do you think, whether or not those symbols exist? If you're going to make a flag for a fictitious nation, maybe you want to see if that flag already exists somewhere, or if the flag is borrowing elements from an existing country. If you're going to be making a game like, Resident Evil 5, where you're having a white protagonist go after sub-Saharan Africans in a village, you may want to think about how that ethnicity
might be perceived.
Right, and how that issue might inflame sensitivity, like in the U.S. There's a lot of really basic things. What it requires is the developers to, if they can, and I know they can do this, they just have to step back and try and imagine this from the perspective of someone completely, in another country, somewhere else.
But how do we do that? Because I can't, just an obvious thing, I'm a guy. So how do I get in the head of a woman and think like a woman to know what would tick me off or whatever, or
well,
be offensive?
It's tough. You're right. That is difficult. It's a tough thing to do. I know people can do it, but it often comes down to a time issue, like you said. It's like, do I have the time to sit around and ponder how do people in 15 other markets that I'm going to target, how they think about it, and not only think about that, but think about it by age and by gender as well. And it becomes very complicated. So that's where, like, even in my own work, I tend to extrapolate it back out to mostly the locale by locale level. I don't really get so much into like male-female perceptions in that locale because it's crazy.
You could go really granular.
Yeah, now if a client asks me to do that, obviously I do it, but typically it doesn't matter as much because if you're going on the basis of locale on a specific country, those differences, the demographic and gender differences really don't matter. There tends to be a pretty much homogeneous opinion of whether or not something is sensitive. Now, when you're getting, like in the U.S., if you're dealing with issues like ethnicity, gender bias, things like that, then obviously you're going to have differences at different levels, within the society. Because obviously men and women are going to have very different opinions of how, like, women are portrayed in games. So, yeah.
Yeah, I can think of one right off the top of my head. So, if someone wanted to contact you to hire you for your services or whatever, how would they do that?
They do a searchlight signal up in the sky.
What's the most politically incorrect way you can think of?
I can make the most offensive game ever, trust me.
Never mind.
But
sorry I asked.
No, my website, it's nglobe.com.
And that's ENGLOBE?
Yes, exactly. Okay. And they can contact me through there.
Excellent. Well, Kate, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Take care, everybody.
Okay.